Welcome everyone to our study of the Gospel of Mark. As we've seen before over the course of our time together in the Mass Readings Explained, the Church has a 3-year cycle of Sunday readings where she works through what are commonly called the Synoptic Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew for year A, the Gospel of Mark for year B, and then the Gospel of Luke for year C. This year we're in year B, so we're studying the Gospel of Mark. And so what we thought we'd do here at Catholic Productions is put together an introductory video for you on the Gospel of Mark, just to give you some background information before we start our study in ordinary time of the life and the ministry of Christ in particular. So what we're going to do in this video is just give some background information, some introductory insights, kind of an overview of what's unique, what's distinctive, and what's special about the second gospel, the gospel according to St. Mark. So, by way of introduction, a couple of things. First and foremost, if you open a New Testament, open a Greek New Testament, you're going to find out that the Gospel of Mark is the second gospel in the New Testament. And this positioning of the Gospel of Mark is something that goes back to ancient times. If we look at ancient lists of what was called the canon, or the rule of faith, the official list of which books were regarded as inspired, the most common positioning of the Gospel of Mark was to put it second after the Gospel of St. Matthew. Matthew is always first in the list, and Mark is second. So sometimes you'll hear Mark actually called the second Gospel, although as we'll see, there's some debate about the exact dating of the Gospel. The second unique feature of Mark's Gospel, and the one that I think will stand out the most if you read it for yourself, is that Mark's is the shortest Gospel. So for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, we had 28 chapters. The Gospel of Luke contains 24 chapters. The Gospel of John consists of 21 chapters. But when we turn to the Gospel of Mark, it's only 16 chapters. It's much shorter. It's dramatically shorter than the other 3 Gospels. And so that's something to keep in mind as we're working through it. You're going to be noticing certain things are missing from the Gospel of Mark. For example, unlike Matthew and Luke, there's no account of the nativity of Jesus. There's no account of his birth or the birth of John the Baptist or the Magi or the shepherds or any of that stuff. Those are only in Matthew and Luke. Mark, as we'll see, dives straight in, almost in a sense, in the middle of the story with the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. So that's another aspect of Mark's Gospel. It's extremely short. In fact, one year I remember I actually sat down and just read the whole Gospel of Mark out loud in one sitting. And you can do that. It's pretty easy to do. And I actually recommend it. It's a great way to get a sense of the dynamic character of this gospel. As you're going to see a little bit later, we're going to talk about this. It's a very action-packed gospel. Not only is it short, but it moves quickly. The story of Jesus moves with a certain momentum that's unique to Mark's gospel. A third interesting feature of this gospel is that it might be called, you could call this the common gospel. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that it's ordinary. What I mean by that is that over 95% of the stories about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark can also be found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. In other words, Mark gives us the common tradition about Jesus, which scholars sometimes call the triple tradition. The stories about Jesus that are found in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So as you're reading through the Gospel of Mark over the course of this year, year B, if you were with us for our journey through the Gospel of Matthew in year A, you're going to notice a lot of similarities with the Sunday reading Gospel passages, because all of them are in the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, if you look through the Gospel of Mark, there are really only a couple of what scholars call pericopes, short stories that can be broken out and taken out of the book. Pericope means to cut around, like literally you can cut the story out. There are really only 2 key pericopes that are in Mark and that aren't in Matthew and Luke. The first one is the story of the blind man of Bethsaida, which is in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus heals the man, and it takes him a couple of attempts, so to speak. Like he heals him partially, and the man says, I can see men, but they look like trees walking, and then he has to heal him completely. That story is only in Mark. And then the other story, which is very famous, is the story of the naked young man who runs through the Garden of Gethsemane as he flees from the soldiers, which is a bizarre story. It's in Mark chapter 14, only found in Mark. Apart from those 2 stories, everything else pretty much that's in Mark, all the stories that are in Mark, can also be found in Matthew or Luke's Gospel. So one of the things you want to keep your eye on as we're moving through year B together is the fact that the gospel readings are going to sometimes be the same as ones we saw in year A, but the Old Testament and responsorial psalms are going to change. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. This is the common gospel. It's going to be familiar territory. However, as we'll see, and this is really interesting, although the stories in Mark are all found in the Gospel of Matthew, the details within those stories are not all the same. Okay, so what you'll often find is, although Mark has far fewer stories about Jesus than Matthew or Luke does, Mark's version of those stories is often more detailed, or the most detailed, which some scholars are going to chalk up to Mark being derived from Peter's eyewitness testimony. We'll get to that a little bit later. So it's a kind of paradoxical situation. We're going to have fewer stories about Jesus from Mark, but they'll sometimes be longer and more detailed. Like, just an example off the top of my head, is the story of the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5 is very detailed, where the man says, we are legion, when he's talking about being possessed by thousands of demons. So keep your eye on that. It's the common gospel. So Mark's gospel is the second gospel. It's the shortest gospel. It's the common gospel. Number 4, it's also, unfortunately, in terms of the history of the church, you could call it the least popular gospel. And this is just a fact of history. As you work through the ancient times and medieval times and things like that, lots and lots of commentaries were written on Matthew, or on the Gospel of Luke, or on the Gospel of John. Matthew and John were by far the most popular Gospels to comment on. So we have commentaries on Matthew from Origen of Alexandria, from St. John Chrysostom. He wrote on Matthew and John. We have commentaries on Luke from Origen and St. Ambrose and things like that. But we don't get a commentary on Mark until the 6th century or so, 6th or 7th century, I can't remember off the top of my head, an anonymous commentary on the Gospel of Mark. It just wasn't as popular a gospel for the church fathers to talk about. So it was relatively neglected in ancient and medieval times. I think in part too because it contains no account of the infancy of Christ, which has always been one of the most popular parts of the Gospels, the story of Jesus' birth. But it also was just because whenever you could find a story in Mark, you'd also be able to find it in Matthew, and Matthew's first, so people would just be inclined to focus first and foremost on Matthew's version of those books. So that's something to keep in mind. It's going to be a little harder to find quotations from the church fathers on this particular gospel. So it's the least popular in that sense, although it was always considered inspired, and no one ever, as we'll see in a minute, no one ever doubted that it was an apostolic gospel. It was just short, and all the stories that were found in it were in the others, so it wasn't as frequently focused on or quoted from. A fifth aspect of the Gospel of Mark that's worth highlighting here is the imagery, the symbolic imagery usually associated with Mark. So, for example, if you go into churches, lots of times there'll be iconography associated with each of the 4 evangelists. And the symbol that's associated with Mark's gospel traditionally has come to be the lion, right? So you'll see these images of an eagle, a lion, an ox, and a man or an angel-like looking man. Each of those is usually correlated with one of the 4 Gospels. The man or the angel associated with Matthew, the ox associated with Luke, the eagle associated with St. John, and then Mark is linked with the lion. Now, just as a side note, you might not be aware of this, but that symbolism, it really goes back to the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 4, St. John has a vision of the heavenly temple and heavenly worship. And there he sees these, quote, 4 living creatures in verse 6, full of eyes in front and behind. And then he goes on to say in verse 7, the first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature was like an ox, the third living creature was the face of a man, and then the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. Now, in context there, John is seeing a vision of the seraphim. These are angelic beings that he sees represented. You can tell this from the background in Isaiah chapter 6. But in the tradition of the church outside the New Testament, those 4 angels came to be associated with the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there was some debate about which one went with which in the early church fathers, but the view that eventually prevailed was that the lion and St. Mark were linked with one another, which is interesting because Mark's gospel is the most action-packed. Like, it's like a lion, it's a powerful gospel. and it rushes through the ministry of Jesus. Mark doesn't waste any time. He moves from episode to episode to episode to episode, from healing to miracle, from miracle to healing, from wonder to wonder. And so, and every episode is usually followed by, and immediately Jesus did this, and immediately he did that, and immediately he did this. So there is a sense of kind of a dynamic power to Mark's gospel that I think at least is fitting in light of the connection between Mark and the lion. So keep that in mind. This is the lion's gospel. It's something to think about as you read the Gospel of Mark. You're gonna, that sense of his personality as a guy who was interested in getting things done and telling how Jesus got things done, that's going to come across as you read through this particular book. So all you cholerics out there, if that's your temperament, if you know anything about the four temperaments, choleric, phlegmatic, sanguine, and melancholic, Mark is definitely a choleric. Right? He's interested in action and getting things done. And that's the aspect of Jesus' personality that he's going to highlight. Finally, I'd like to highlight number 6 here, that although in the history of the church, Mark was relatively neglected or was the least popular gospel, in modern times there's been something of that we might call kind of Markan revolution. Because since the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, scholars have kind of done an about-face on the significance of Mark, and Mark now tends to be regarded by most New Testament scholars today as actually having been the first gospel, not the second gospel, but the first gospel, in the sense that it was the first to be written, and therefore also the one that is in some ways closest to Jesus. We'll come back to that in just a second. We'll talk about that in a little more detail, but keep that in mind. For the last 200 years, an enormous number of books have been written on this particular Gospel of Mark, because scholarship has focused its interest on this enigmatic second gospel. Now, okay, that's just a brief outline of some summary introductory points about the distinctives of Mark's gospel. I'd like now to talk a little bit about the history of the book with regard to questions of authorship, date, right, location. Who wrote the Gospel of Mark? When was it written? Where was it written? What's the evidence for our conclusions in those regard? So first, let's start off with the Gospel of Mark in the early church. If you open your Bible to that second Gospel, you're going to see there a title. In your New Testament, it's going to say the Gospel according to Mark. And that title goes back to all of our earliest manuscripts of the Gospel. There are no anonymous copies. They are all unanimous in attributing the book to this figure of Mark. Well, who was Mark? Well, if we look at other writings in the New Testament, we can get some information about him, especially the Acts of the Apostles. If you turn to Acts chapter 12, Acts chapter 12, verse 12 to 14, we have the story of Peter's imprisonment in Jerusalem during the early days of the church. Herod has imprisoned Peter at Passover. Peter is miraculously released from prison by an angel. And after Peter makes his way out of prison, we read these words in Acts 12, verse 12. When Peter realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. All right. So, and then it goes on to say how Peter came into their midst. But that verse there is very important because the author of Acts is telling us that this figure, John Mark, who was one of the early Christians, was evidently first Jewish, because his mother's name was Mary. Yeah, that's a Jewish name. And also apparently a resident of Jerusalem, who was known to the early Christian church, and in particular to Peter as well. Obviously, Peter here would have to know Mary's family very well and trust them very closely if that's going to be the first place he goes after he's released from prison and he's looking for a safe haven. He goes to John Mark's house in Jerusalem. And sure enough, if we skip over to the first letter of Peter, chapter 5, verse 13, we find evidence in the first letter of Peter that Mark was not only known to Peter, but that he apparently traveled with St. Peter and was even regarded as a kind of spiritual son by St. Peter. So in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter says this, "She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with the kiss of love." So again, there are debates about whether Peter wrote this epistle or not. We can't go into that in this video. but the letter is attributed to Peter and was regarded as having been written by Peter unanimously by ancient Christians. And so what we have here is evidence that Peter traveled around with this same figure of Mark as a companion, as a disciple, and as a kind of spiritual son of his. Which is interesting because the same figure is also described as a companion and fellow traveler of the other great apostle, St. Paul. So in St. Paul's letter to Philemon, his famous short epistle to Philemon, in verses 23 and 24, he too ends his letter with a mention of Mark. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you, and so does Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So Paul identifies this figure of Mark as one of his fellow workers. And the same thing happens in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, as well as Colossians 4, verses 10 through 11. So in sum, when you look at all of the data from the New Testament, I left one point out, this is actually important. In the book of Acts chapter 13, in Acts chapter 15, there is a famous story. I have to read this to you because it's cool. In Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 40, we have evidence that not only did Paul and Mark travel together, but they stopped traveling together because they got into a big fight. So this is kind of fun. In Acts 15, verse 36, it says, after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, come, let us return, visit the brethren in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are. And Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, reference to the same character. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. In other words, Mark had split off from them at a previous point in the ministry, and so Paul doesn't want to travel with him anymore. And it says, there arose a sharp contention, so that they separated from one another. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. It's kind of interesting. Even apostles and saints can get into disagreements about what the will of the Lord is, and we see that here with St. Paul and St. Mark, that they parted ways during their ministry. Although by the end of Paul's ministry in 2 Timothy 4, they've obviously reconciled, because Paul again mentions Mark as being with him in Rome while he's awaiting his execution. So that's just some of the data from the New Testament. It gives us a kind of a profile of Mark. So Mark would have been a Jewish Christian, a resident of Jerusalem, one of the early disciples in the sense that he was part of that initial group of the church in Jerusalem, but we have no evidence that he was an eyewitness to Jesus, right? He wasn't one of the 12, he wasn't one of the apostles, and as far as we know, his first encounters with Jesus would have been when Jesus went to Jerusalem, whether in the last year of his life or earlier. That's all we really know about him. Now it's this figure, this Mark, to whom the gospel, the second gospel in the New Testament, is attributed. That's what the title of your book means. When it says the gospel according to Mark, that's the person to whom the book is being attributed. And so the internal evidence from the titles of the manuscript suggests to us that this Jewish Christian who was a companion of Peter and Paul is the author of the second gospel. But as we all know, if we've studied ancient writings from the early church, known as the lost gospels or the apocryphal gospels, books can be forged. And so gospels can be attributed to people who did not compose them, like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas. These were 2nd and 3rd century writings that were falsely attributed to apostles and eyewitnesses. So if we're asking the question about who was regarded as the author of this book, it's also important to look at the early church as well, to look at the writings of ancient Christians known as the early church fathers. These were bishops and priests and deacons in churches that were founded by the apostles or who succeeded in their office from the apostles. So in this case, one of the first church fathers that's significant is Papias. You can hear it pronounced Papias sometimes, either way. Papias of Hierapolis. He was an Eastern Christian father. He was writing around 100, 110 AD, and he was an important figure because he was only one generation removed from the apostles. He knew the apostles themselves, and he wrote a commentary on the 4 Gospels, fragments of which have been preserved by Eusebius, another early church historian. And Eusebius quotes from Papias' commentary, and he has this to say about who wrote the Gospel of Mark. So these are Papias' own words. Quote, "The elder John used to say this, Mark, having become Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. For he," meaning Mark, neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But afterward, as I said, followed Peter, who adapted his teachings as needed, but had not intention of giving an ordered account of the Lord's sayings. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong in writing down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything that he heard or to make any false statement in them. And that quotation is from Eusebius's Church History, Book 3, Section 39, verse 15. Okay, notice here a couple things. This is the earliest reference we have, external evidence, for who wrote the second gospel, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And Papias is really clear that it was written by John Mark, who was not just the companion of St. Peter, but also his interpreter, which may mean that he was Peter's translator or that he was Peter's scribe, or both. It could be either one of those. Hermeneutes is the Greek word. We get the word hermeneutics, or interpretation. The art of interpretation is from that Greek word. In any case, Papias is really clear that Peter is giving oral testimony about what Jesus did and said, and that Mark is acting as a scribe in some way by transcribing or writing down that testimony. And you can kind of see, it's interesting here, Papias is a little bit, shall we say, embarrassed by the Gospel of Mark, because he's at pains to point out that Mark didn't write everything down in order, okay? It's not as orderly, say, as Matthew's Gospel. So if you remember, if we've journeyed with us through year A in the Gospel of Matthew, you have a very orderly account of Jesus' ministry. You have the 5 speeches. Or think of Luke's Gospel, where he actually says at the beginning, I'm writing accurately and in order the things that took place, right? And you can see that attention to order, especially in the Passion narratives, where attention to the timing chronology becomes really critical. But here, Papias is basically saying, look, I know Mark didn't write in order. It's a little messy, so to speak. But what we know is that he made it his one concern not to omit anything that Peter said, and not to make any mistakes about Peter's testimony. So again, notice Papias recognizes Mark himself is not an eyewitness. So how do we know that his testimony is reliable? What's the source of its reliability? Well, Papias is really clear. It's because he's getting it not just from an eyewitness, but from the chief of the apostles, St. Peter himself. Which, by the way, we haven't gotten there yet, but it's kind of an argument against the idea that the title of Mark is forged, or that it's falsely attributed. Because if the gospel was originally anonymous and somebody wanted to falsely attribute it to someone in order to give it authority, it should have been called the Gospel of Peter. That would have been a much easier thing than this roundabout way of saying, well, Mark wrote it down, he was a scribe, trust me, he did a good job, and that kind of. So the early church fathers here recognize it's second generation in that sense, or it's second-hand testimony, but it's based on first-hand testimony, and that's important for them. The reason they attribute it to Mark is probably because, as we'll see, Mark wrote it. That's the most logical explanation. In any case, what's interesting about the early church's perspective on Mark is that if we look at other ancient church fathers, they're completely unanimous that the book was written by John Mark, the companion and disciple of Peter and Paul. And we could go into this a lot more detail. I'd encourage you to check out my book, The Case for Jesus, if you want more information on this. But it really is fascinating that although Mark's the shortest gospel and it's kind of the least popular, we actually have more information about Mark and about his composition of the second gospel than we do about any of the other 4 gospels. Okay? So for example, Irenaeus of Lyon in the late 2nd century AD, around 180, tells us that the book was written by, quote, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter. Clement of Alexandria, so go all the way down to Egypt, tells us the same, that during the reign of Claudius, which is around the 40s AD, Peter went to Rome, that he founded a church there in Rome, and that this gospel was written by Mark, his companion and interpreter, and that it was, quote, ratified by Peter for the study in the churches, end quote. So interesting there, Clement of Alexandria is saying not only was it written by Mark, Peter's disciple, but it was written during Peter's lifetime, right? And that Peter knew of the gospel and that he approved of it. He gave it his apostolic approval for publication and study in the churches. A little further down the road, around 200 AD, Origen of Alexandria, who was Clement's successor, tells us that Mark's gospel was written second, that it was second in composition after Matthew, Matthew having been first, and that it was, quote, done in accordance with Peter's instructions, end quote. So Origen saw this as something that, again, Peter himself approved and in a sense maybe even commissioned for Mark to do. Once we get down to the 4th century, the time of St. Jerome, one of the greatest biblical scholars in the early church, he tells us the same thing, that this book was written by Peter's disciple and interpreter, that Peter both, quote, heard of it and, quote, approved of it. And Jerome adds that after the composition of the gospel, Mark later went to Egypt and became the bishop of Alexandria there. He formed a church there and later died there, which is kind of interesting because notice two of the people telling us Mark wrote this gospel are Origen and Clement, who are both priests in the church of Alexandria. So that memory of who Mark was would have been retained in that particular Egyptian Christian community. So their testimony is significant there. If Mark was the bishop, they would have some more direct access to what his literary activity was. And then finally, this one's funny. There's an anonymous Latin prologue to a copy of Mark that gives us an extra detail. It tells us that Mark, John Mark, was, quote, stumpy-fingered, right? That his fingers were too short for his body. He had a deformity on his hands. And so they actually have a Greek word for this, that he was stumpy-fingered. And nevertheless, he was a scribe, and he wrote the gospel. In this case, the Latin prologue says after Peter's death, which is interesting, because Peter probably dies around 66 AD, which would put the Gospel of Mark sometime after that, 67, 68, or whatever. Okay, so that's a little survey of the evidence in the early church. What does that evidence tell us? A couple things. First, there's complete unanimity among the early church fathers about who wrote the gospel. All of them say the same thing. Manuscripts say the same thing. The fathers say the same thing. It's written by John Mark, a disciple of Peter and Paul and companion of those apostles. Second, they all agree that it was written in Rome. That's also very, very clear that Mark was with Peter and Paul in the church at Rome, and that's where the gospel was composed, and that's for whom it was composed. Third, though, when it comes to the date of the gospel, there is some ambiguity. There's some difference there, disagreement even, right? Some of the church fathers make it really clear that the gospel was written while Peter was still alive. This would put it sometime before 64, 66 AD, when Peter was martyred in Rome under Caesar Nero. Others, like the anonymous Latin prologue, say, no, it was actually composed after Peter's death, based on Mark's memory of what Peter had said and what Peter had done while he was teaching the disciples in the church at Rome. So division or disagreement about the date of the gospel, some disagreement there, but no disagreement about authorship. That's kind of or location in that regard. All right, now, if you fast forward to contemporary times, what about modern scholars on Mark? Okay, when we turn to contemporary scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries, the situation is really different. With regard to authorship, there is a divide. I wouldn't say it's 50-50, it's probably 60-40. The majority of scholars basically take the position that Mark's gospel is originally anonymous, or that we don't know who wrote it. So you have scholars say originally the gospel was published without any title, and if you look at certain aspects of the gospel, it just seems unlikely that John Mark could actually have written the book. Let me give you one example about that position. So if you look in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, scholars who deny that John Mark wrote the book will frequently say, if you look in chapter 7, the author seems to be ignorant of ancient Jewish customs when he says these words. Quote, "Now when the Pharisees gathered together to him and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples, Jesus' disciples, ate with hands defiled, that is, unwashed." And then the author adds a parenthetical note. "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they purify themselves. And there are many other traditions which they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze." That aside right there is only in Mark's gospel. It's not in Luke and it's not in Matthew, although the story is in there. Those were gospels. And so scholars will say, well, look, this is erroneous because if you look at first century Judaism, Josephus tells us there were many different sects of Jews in the first century. You had the Essenes who lived out at the Dead Sea that practiced celibacy. You had the Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection, didn't believe in the prophets. You had the Zealots who were like a militaristic group within Judaism. And then you had the Pharisees. The Pharisees were just one sect within many. So Mark here, these scholars will say, reveals his ignorance of Judaism when he says that all the Jews don't eat unless they wash their hands, okay? Because that is actually a Pharisaic custom and not a universal Jewish custom. So scholars will say, on the basis of that and other things in the book, that this couldn't have been written by a Jewish Christian. It would have to have been written by a Gentile who was ignorant of the variety and diversity within Judaism in the first century. Well, at first glance that might sound convincing, but the problem with it is that it's just wrong. In fact, if you study ancient Judaism from the time, we have writings that were actually written by Jews. For example, the letter of Aristeas is a first century Jewish writing that says the same thing Mark says here. All the Jews wash their hands before they eat. And the reality is we don't know exactly how many Jews practice this custom or not. In other words, we don't have any evidence that the Sadducees or the Essenes or the Zealots didn't do this. All the evidence we have from the first century, Mark's Gospel and the letter of Aristeas, tells us actually this was a universal Jewish custom of practicing a kind of ritual purity. The other thing is, even if it wasn't, Mark here could be doing something that's very common, which is called exaggeration. In other words, when he says all, he doesn't mean absolutely every Jew without exception. He just means the majority of Jews do this, right? You could say, all Americans celebrate Christmas. Well, not every single American does it, but lots of people, the majority of Americans do celebrate Christmas in some way, shape, or fashion, right? So that's just something to keep in mind there. It's probably pressing the text too far to make it sound as if Mark's ignorant, especially when we have Jewish sources themselves that say all the Jews wash their hands. So, also, when you read through the Gospel, as we will this year together, you're going to see that Mark's Gospel is very, very Jewish, right? He's going to consistently presuppose that you understand the Old Testament, you understand the Jewish scriptures. He's going to give you Aramaic words like Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, or Talitha kumi, little girl arise, Ephphatha, be opened, right? That are going to reveal that he knows Semitic languages. Now, how does he know Semitic languages if he's not a Jew? Okay, Gentiles in the ancient world didn't know Hebrew and Aramaic. That was not their tongue. That was something that Jewish people did. So for Mark to use these Semitic expressions and translate them strongly supports the ancient contention that he was, in fact, a Jewish Christian. Another interesting thing about the Gospel is, in terms of authorship, it's very Petrine. What do you mean by Petrine? I mean that it's focused on Peter. In other words, if you look at the stories of the Gospel of Mark, they're going to be frequently told, in a sense, from Peter's point of view, and they're going to give you little insights and details about Peter as a character. Peter is going to emerge as a very real figure in this Gospel, and actually a very flawed figure too. You're going to see Peter's flaws, warts and all. You're going to see him constantly putting his foot in his mouth, making mistakes, misjudging Jesus. And you get the sense that this Gospel, after Jesus, Peter is the most important person in this Gospel, which again would make sense if it's written by the actual John Mark, a companion and disciple of St. Peter. All right, what about the date of the Gospel? Again, in modern times, there is a debate about when it was written. So the majority of scholars will tend to say the Gospel of Mark was written after 70 AD, or at least around 70 AD, which is when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. In 70 AD, the Romans came in and they overthrew the Jewish temple and burned the city of Jerusalem to the ground. And the reason scholars think that that event is significant for dating the Gospel is because in Mark chapter 13, Jesus gives an extended prophecy of the temple's destruction, in which he says, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. In other words, Jerusalem and the temple are going to be destroyed. And then if you go on down to verse 14, Jesus goes on to say, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house or take anything away. Let him who is in the field not turn back to take his mantle, so on and so forth. So what scholars will say is, that reference there to the desolating sacrilege is an allusion to the prophecy in Daniel of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Daniel chapter 9, verse 25 to 27. What they'll say is that because Mark has that little aside, let the reader understand, what he's doing is cluing into his audience, hey, remember what just happened in the destruction of Jerusalem? That's what Jesus was talking about. So they interpret it as a kind of aside to the reader, and therefore as a prophecy after the fact. In other words, the Olivet Discourse is Jesus' words being given to us through Mark, who already knows that they've been fulfilled in the temple's destruction. So if those words are prophecy after the fact, then that would put Mark's gospel to be dated sometime either around or shortly after 70 AD. Okay. Frequently, scholars who make this argument will have the assumption that Jesus couldn't possibly have accurately predicted the temple's destruction, and therefore any prediction of the temple being destroyed or Jerusalem being destroyed necessarily has to come after the event, okay, because prophecy is impossible, according to a kind of rationalistic point of view. Okay, what about that? Well, there are other scholars, a smaller number, but still some who will say, no, that argument doesn't hold water for a number of reasons. First, Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. Even if you don't believe in his divinity, he could easily have done this because of the mounting conflict with Rome that was taking place in the first century, long before the temple was destroyed, and because, even more importantly, the temple had been destroyed already. It was destroyed in 587 BC by the Babylonian Empire in a very similar situation. So if a Jew saw that things were getting politically tumultuous, he could easily look back to the prophets of the Old Testament and say, you know what? What happened once is going to happen again if we continue to sin like we've been sinning, or if we continue to engage in corruption, or if we treat the temple like it's a den of thieves instead of a house of God. You know, those kind of things. Things like Jesus actually said when he went into the temple in Jerusalem. So other scholars will say, no, Mark 13 is not prophecy after the fact, it's prophecy before the fact. And we can show that by pointing out that Luke's gospel and the Acts of Apostles appear to have been written before the temple's destruction. Because if you look at the ending to the Acts of the Apostles, it ends with Paul still in prison, not with the martyrdom of Paul, but Paul still in prison around probably 62 or 63 AD. And scholars like Adolf von Harnack famously argued that the reason Acts ends with Paul still alive is because Acts was written when Paul was still alive. And that matters for the date of Mark's gospel, because if we look at Luke's gospel carefully, we'll see that Luke has copied word for word a lot of the material from Mark's gospel into his own book. In other words, Mark comes before Luke, Luke comes before Acts, and if Acts is written before Paul is dead, then obviously Mark couldn't have been written 10 years later, after 70 AD. It would need to be sometime before 60 AD or so. All right, so anyway, obviously that's kind of complex debate. Dating can be very difficult in ancient texts and ancient sources. But for our purposes here, it's just important to note that if you take the dating of Acts seriously, and if you think Luke copied from Mark's gospel, then we should actually probably be dating Mark sometime before 62 AD. How long before? Who knows? We don't know. We weren't there. But sometime before that event, while people like Peter and Paul were still alive. Very important. While some of these eyewitnesses were still alive. Side note, by the way, in terms of external evidence, if you look at the early church fathers like Jerome and others, they'll actually say that Mark died in 62 AD in Alexandria while he was bishop there. Now, if that is true, then that would actually put Mark's gospel a lot earlier. It would have to be in the 50s, because it's hard to write when you're dead. Okay, sorry, that's an old joke, but I love it. It never gets old. All right, finally, what about key themes in the Gospel of Mark? Enough background material. What's unique about this book? I would say that there are two aspects of Mark's Gospel that really stand out as significant for me, and that I hope you'll pay attention to as we journey through the book this year in year B. The first one is the theme of spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that in Mark's gospel, Jesus is, yes, he's the Son of God. Yes, he's the Messiah. But in some sense, above all, Jesus is an exorcist. He's a healer. He's a wonder worker who is engaged in a battle between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan, right? So this undergirding theme of spiritual warfare is really evident in Mark's focus on the actions of Jesus, on the miracles of Jesus, and especially on the exorcisms of Jesus, which are his manifestation of his power over the demonic, right? So if you want a comparison here, think about Matthew's gospel from year A. A lot of Matthew's gospel are Jesus' words, his teachings. If you have a red letter edition of your Bible and you open up, Matthew is very red, lots of words of Jesus. If you look at Mark's gospel, by contrast, it's less focused on Jesus' speeches and more focused on his actions, his doings. So there are only really two long speeches in Mark's gospel. Mark chapter 4, which is the parables discourse, and then Mark chapter 13, which is the discourse on the Mount of Olives. Apart from that, Jesus is doing things, right? He says stuff, don't get me wrong, but it's always in the context of an action, a healing, an exorcism, a miracle of some kind or another, okay? And it's all part of his spiritual warfare with the kingdom of Satan. He's come to undo the works of the devil. So keep your eye on that. I don't think most people today think of Jesus as an exorcist. Like if I say The Exorcist, you think of the movie that was made back in the 1970s, or many people will think of that movie. But Mark's gospel is really the gospel of Jesus the exorcist, or Jesus the spiritual warrior. And I think that's something not unique to Mark, but distinctive of Mark's gospel. The second thing about Mark's gospel that's kind of a key theme is the idea of a mystery or a secret of Jesus' identity. So we'll see, for example, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus uses actually the language of telling the disciples, to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom. There's something secret, there's something hidden, there's something invisible that needs to be unveiled. And over again in the gospel, part of that secret is going to be the identity of Jesus. Who is he? And we'll see over and over again, the demons will say, hey, we know who you are, the Holy One of God or the Son of God. And Jesus will silence them, tell them not to tell anybody. Or he'll heal somebody and he'll say, shh, don't say anything, like to the leper in chapter 2. What's that all about? Well, it's the fact that part of Jesus' mission in this gospel is going to be to conceal his identity until the time is right. Okay? He'll reveal it to the disciples in Mark chapter 8, but then above all, he's going to reveal it to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin at his trial, when he will affirm that he is in fact not just the Messiah, but the divine Son of God. And then they're going to kill him for it under the charge of blasphemy. So the secret of Jesus' identity, and I would argue the secret of his divinity, right? That he's not just the Messiah, he's the divine Son of God who will sit at the right hand of God, coming on the clouds of heaven. All right, so that's a little overview there. Finally, with regard to the contents of Mark's gospel, what are we going to see in year B? Just a quick overview. First, the baptism of Jesus ordinarily is the first Sunday of ordinary time. That's in Mark 1. So we do have a record of Jesus' baptism. That's where this book begins. Then the 2nd through 16th Sundays is going to focus on Jesus' Galilean ministry in Mark chapters 2 through 6. So we'll be walking slowly through that Galilean ministry. But then something interesting and unique happens, and this only happens in year B. For 5 weeks, for 5 Sundays, the church is going to actually stop reading Mark in year B and going to insert 5 Sundays of readings from the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Okay. Why does she do this? Well, in part because Mark's so short. It's just a very short gospel. It's only 16 chapters, and we have 34 Sundays in ordinary time. So what the church has done is taken a part of John's gospel, one of the most important passages in the Gospel of John, the feeding of the 5,000 and the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6, and gives it to the faithful to hear, to be preached on every 3rd year in year B on the 17th through 21st Sundays in ordinary time. Now after that takes place, and that usually takes place sometime in the summertime, so keep your eye out for that. All of a sudden we'll switch to the Gospel of John in the summertime. After that, the church picks up again on the 22nd through 26th Sundays with Jesus' ministry in Galilee continued. That's Mark chapter 7 through 9. Then it shifts, and in the 27th through 33rd Sundays, we move into Jesus' ministry in Judea. That's Mark 10 through 13. Keep your eye on this as you're reading through the Gospel of Mark, because the opposition to Jesus is going to mount as he moves southward, as he moves from Galilee to Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem, which is where he's going to eventually die. And then finally, on the 34th Sunday of Christ the King, the church will again pull from John once more, giving us a passage from John chapter 18, okay, and ending it with that. So something unique about Mark's year, you want to keep in mind that year B is, in a sense, the year of the Gospel of Mark primarily, but you're also going to get a lot of the Gospel of St. John. So you might want to reread through that Gospel as well as we prepare to take this journey through the life of Christ as given to us by St. Mark.